All right, now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Kevin Sabet is an author, drug policy consultant, and former advisor to 3 U.S. presidential administrations. He studied, researched, written about, and implemented drug policy for 20 years, which is amazing. He's currently the president and CEO of SAM, which stands for Smart Approaches to Marijuana, a nonprofit organization he founded with Congressman Patrick Kennedy and David Frum. His book, Reefer, Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana, was published in its 2nd edition in 2017 and can be found in the back on a table as you leave if you'd like to purchase it after this presentation. He's also the director of Drug Policy Institute at the University of South Florida and is the author of numerous monographs and peer-review articles. He has a doctorate of philosophy and a master's of science from Oxford University and a BA from the University of California at Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Sabet.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a week. I don't know what day it is. It's only Monday. Oh, my gosh. On a weeknight. Tuesday. Is it Tuesday or Monday? I can't keep track. Good. All right. 2 days down. And it's great to be with you to talk about this issue. Thanks for mentioning the alma mater, Berkeley. You know, we had a group there called Citizens for a Drug-Free Berkeley. I know you want to laugh, and you can, because it was about as popular as the Coalition for a Wine-Free France. So it's nice to be in front of maybe a little bit of a better audience. But actually, it's interesting because 20 years ago at Berkeley, we probably couldn't have imagined that the movement to, I would say, normalize marijuana would not only be happening so quickly, but would actually leave, frankly, the hippies of Berkeley behind. Because it's not really about the hippies of Berkeley anymore. It's about the wolves of Wall Street, and it's about money. And that's kind of the end. That's sort of the thesis of the talk. If you're done and want to leave, I won't be offended. But essentially, that's what I'm really concerned about. And I'm not here to tell you, and I see a lot of young people in the audience, or a few, which is great. I'm not here to tell you, that marijuana is the devil's weed, and that if you do it, you're going to, become a cocaine user the next day, or it's going to destroy your life for sure. I'm not even here to tell you how you feel or how you should feel about the issue of the legalization of marijuana or medical marijuana, which are issues that you've grappled with. But I look in the audience, I see many people that I've collaborated with. Some I've only known for a few months or even a few weeks, and I've heard their stories. Some I've known for a very long time, 15, 20 years, because of their heartbreaking stories. And none of these people, and I won't name the 7 or 8 people that I know here that I know have been personally affected by drugs, none of the issue of the heroin epidemic that we're going through and the opioid epidemic, nobody starts using drugs by sticking a needle in their arm or snorting something through their nose. We're talking about the normalization of substances in our society, and they start with the most common and the most accepted, which of course are alcohol, which we can't deny, and I would argue marijuana. And I think it's just really important that we're here to, all I ask you to do, again, not here to tell you not to do drugs, I'm here to tell you just to have an open mind, because I feel like we are being bombarded right now by messages and this idea that, marijuana is a harmless plant and we really have nothing to worry about. And I'm very worried, frankly. I feel like we're living not in 2019, as I'll show you later, but I feel like we're living in 1919 for tobacco. That's how I feel. In 1919 for tobacco, we already began to get the studies linking tobacco with lung cancer. But it took the tobacco industry about 90 years after that to admit it. It took our government 60 years to admit it. And we were in the midst of the greatest public health crisis in human history, and that's the tobacco epidemic. It kills, to this day, 10 times as many people a year as the worst year of the opioid epidemic, folks. And it's not because tobacco is more harmful than heroin, right? If you had your son, you had to choose whether they were going to smoke a cigarette or snort or inject heroin, of course you would say smoke a cigarette. We're not saying that that cigarette is worse than that. But because that cigarette was manipulated, first of all, by the tobacco industry manipulating the tobacco, but normalized and commercialized and so part of our culture for so long, that cigarette is actually a lot deadlier on a societal level than a drug like heroin that in its worst year killed about 45,000 people a year. And in tobacco, it still kills 480,000 people a year. And that's with smoking going down, because it takes about 20 years to kill you. You know, lung cancer doesn't happen like that. Of course, a heroin overdose can happen like that, and that's the deadly part of it. Tobacco happens over time. And I worry, sort of stepping back, that we're going through this same cycle with marijuana, a plant that's been around for thousands of years, just like tobacco, but now is being manipulated and turned into a product that anybody over 40 in this audience would have no idea. You wouldn't be able to point out the marijuana in a lot of different marijuana that I would show you, because I would show you a flash drive that had 90% THC in it. You wouldn't know that was marijuana, because that wasn't what we were passing around at Berkeley 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In fact, someone said the term the other day, roach clip, in front of an audience of 16-year-olds. They thought it was a kind of insect extermination, right? And if you're laughing, you're showing your age. I hate to say it, but so we're talking about something else. So I just want you to separate in your mind the prejudice that we all have with marijuana, because that's old marijuana. I think there's old marijuana and there's new marijuana, and they're very different. And I'm really worried about new marijuana, because that is what the guys I went to Oxford with that are now in their late 30s and early 40s and are smart as hell are marketing and commercializing and trying to make a lot of money off of. And that, I think, is why we need to step back, look at the science in a dispassionate way, and decide whether it's your own choices, like I was saying in the beginning about what you do or what you tell your children, or whether it's the policy choices that you might make, whether you're voting for somebody who has a position or whatnot, based on the best available information. And right now, we don't have a lot of good information, because what happens when you Google marijuana and health is that you get the Google search results sponsored by the marijuana industry. Now, that's our modern day version of going to the doctor's office in the 1950s and seeing magazines paid for by big tobacco, who paid off the doctors, to say that, there are certain brands that are great for the throat, or there's candy, the baby ads that said, I want to be just like Papa, that had the baby and holding a dad holding a Chesterfield holding a baby and the baby looking up at him. That we have the same thing again. It's just Instagram and Twitter and Google search results and ads that you see. And I just think we need to kind of separate our prejudices and talk about this. So this is going to sound like ancient history, but there was once a time when both political parties actually worked together and respected each other a lot. And I was lucky enough to work for both administrations. And I served about 2.5 years in the beginning of the Obama administration. And I left when I saw the writing on the wall in terms of this industry and how much more powerful they were getting. And I was worried that we kind of didn't have a focus on it, and nobody was looking into who is this industry, who's funding the drive to, somebody wrote a check for $30 million to legalize marijuana in California. Who was that? Why were they doing that? What was it for? Who was behind Colorado? I mean, a kind of sort of center-right state at the time in 2012. It's changed a lot since then, but 7 years ago, who was writing those checks and why were they doing that? And what was this movement behind what I would call to move to normalize marijuana? And so I started a group called SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, to talk about what is a smart approach to marijuana as we are kind of developing laws and policies. And I was joined by Patrick Kennedy, who was the congressman from Rhode Island for 20 years, Ted Kennedy's son, and someone who had struggled very openly and publicly with addiction and had his battle scars. And he came to me and said, because we were working on things related to the Affordable Care Act, and he came to me and said, my dad fought big tobacco for 50 years. I'm in recovery now at the time, about 2 years only. And are we really going to do this? I mean, what are we thinking as a country? Let's slow down. And so we started Smart Approaches to Marijuana with a science advisory board of leading researchers and also a Republican, David Frum, because we wanted it to really be bipartisan. And we work with numerous medical associations. And what happened was I started when I was at the White House, but also when I left, researching the medical association's positions on marijuana. Because I thought, well, if we should listen to anybody, it should be the medical groups. And there must be some big debate, because if there's a big debate in society, maybe there's some huge scientific debate about what we should do. And when I started researching every single major medical association, there really wasn't a debate. And when I say debate, I don't only mean about policy, but I even mean about the harmfulness, especially to young people. This wasn't something that the AMA was saying, well, we're not really sure. It's sort of mixed evidence. It was actually pretty solid. I'm going to talk about some of that evidence tonight. And so I noticed there was such a disconnect between what the public thought when they thought about marijuana, they thought about the old marijuana, and what the kind of people who study this every day for a living and are not, conflicted or in terms of they're not getting funded by the pot industry or by any industry, what they were saying, what the research was saying. And there was a huge disconnect. And I thought, wow, let's try and, educate the American people on the science. And so that's why we're collaborating. But one of the things, when I sort of approached a lot of these medical groups and said, we want to, we're doing this and we'd love your help, a lot of them said, we've already, printed positions on marijuana. We have peer-reviewed literature, Kevin. We have research that's out there. Isn't that getting through to people? I think we've kind of done we've done our duty. And I said no. There's no. I have a Ph.D. so I can say this. There's no PR in Ph.D. We don't learn to do that. I mean, it's like if you write an opinion article that more than 15 people ever read, that's like almost looked down upon in academia. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nod. I mean, that's not. We speak in front of at conferences where if we get 8 people to come to our section, we're very happy. And if we get 2 people to read a journal article we wrote, to review it, peer review and accept it, and then maybe like 50 people in the world in any given month at the most to read something we've written, we're very thankful for that. And I thought, well, that's part of the reason why there's this disconnect, because the science isn't getting translated into language that anybody can understand. And you have to have a PhD to understand it and even know where to go. And yet the marijuana industry is 50 steps ahead of us. They're hiring the top 10, not hiring, I should say, paying the top 10 social media influencers to talk about this. I mean, they're way ahead. They're doing Google AdWords, so that when you do type medical marijuana, because maybe you're looking into it for your aging parents because they're hurting and you heard that it helped, fair enough, you're typing it in, you're getting all of the stuff about the wonder drug and, and now, of course, a CBD thing, which I can talk about later, and all these things. And you're not really getting what the research and science is. And so that was part of the reason of sort of even wanting to get into this discussion was I was really not happy with the fact that the science wasn't getting down into language that people could understand. As I said, I feel like we're living back in the day about 100 years ago with tobacco. And if we look at the history, as I was kind of just alluding to, like in the doctor's office example I gave, we really are repeating history in so many ways. It wasn't about 150 years ago, 140 years ago, when we were talking about not medical marijuana, but medical tobacco, medical cigarettes. In fact, we really love talking about asthma cigarettes because, cigarettes would be so good for asthma. Makes sense. This is funny, but I think they had at least somewhat of a moral backbone because I don't know if you can read it. They said, not recommended for children under 6. So if you were 7, you were good to go with the asthma cigarettes. And then we kind of moved on to color here and did hired the doctors and, paid off scientists. As you know, we had something called, and for the students in the room interested in history, you should look up things like the Tobacco Research Institute, which was funded by the tobacco industry. It sounded very official and it would be very good. And this basically put out all kinds of pseudoscience that basically questioned any time there would be anything negative. They didn't say it's not happening at all, but it was just kind of this idea of, well, we're not sure, and correlation is not causation, and, you know, it's kind of, there's other factors, and things we hear all the time with marijuana. I mean, there was a study came out last week, peer-reviewed, I mean, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, saying that occasional to moderate, not daily, occasional to moderate marijuana use among teens increased suicide risk by 3.5-fold. And the first thing that the marijuana industry came out with on that was, well, correlation is not causation, and there are other factors. Of course, the researchers said, oh, we actually controlled for the other factors. That's why we got published. You can't just sort of say things. There's a reason why we even got there in the first place. But that's like gets, you know, that's sort of the white noise, and it doesn't translate out, and we're kind of left with this jumble, and what we think about are both sides to the argument, when in reality, for not everything in this, because there's still a lot of science we're doing and we need to learn about, but for a lot of this, there is very little debate in the real scientific circles. There's a lot of debate on Twitter. There's a lot of debate on Instagram. There's a lot of, you know, sort of thinking, if you're under 25 right now, about what marijuana is, but that doesn't comport with what the science is saying. And I sort of am becoming a broken record, but I just think that this is this new era. It's just like tobacco in so many ways. There's so many parallels. You know, I don't know if you know how many people died of tobacco, because I said 480,000 last year. How many people died of tobacco before the advent of the automatic cigarette making machine, which was in the late 1800s, got invented? Almost zero. Wait a minute, how could that be from 0 to 400? But that's true, because we had inhaling pipe tobacco for a very long time, thousands of years. It was throat irritation and things like that, but documentation of direct death and incidents of lung lesions and things like that that would lead to death, very, very little. In the thousands of years that we used tobacco, it wasn't until an industry got a hold of it, where they made, you know, they added additives, they mixed Indian and Turkish tobacco together, which was a blend we'd never had. But most importantly, they created the cigarette, which allowed kind of rapid delivery, easy delivery of something that beforehand was in a much less potent form, much more occasional use, no advertising beforehand. And it's just, for marijuana, to me, it's the same thing. It's taking a plant that, yeah, it's been around for thousands of years, but it's taking something that might have been relatively benign before and turning it into this new form, really for the almighty dollar. I think just when it comes to what you're thinking about, because there's a lot like on the science and the policy, what's really important to understand is that we have to separate these policy issues, because I hear sometimes people saying, well, Kevin, marijuana was great for my mom's cancer, so therefore we should legalize marijuana. And that's like, well, wait, that's like saying, you know, I don't know, Dilaudid, which is liquid heroin, which they use in hospitals. I had to take it once because I had a very bad acute appendicitis about 7 years ago. And morphine did nothing for me, zero. And Dilaudid, which is stronger, helped in the hospital setting. But that's like saying we need to legalize Dilaudid or sort of a liquid heroin preparation because some people who have appendicitis might need it at the time or something. I mean, that's a different issue. And I'm not going to get into too much about the medical side. There's a lot to discuss there. But that's also even a different issue than this issue of decriminalization. Because I just was in Albany earlier today, and you know, people were saying, well, we need legalization because of social justice. We don't want to lock people up for smoking a joint and destroy their lives with an arrest, which I agree, we shouldn't do that. But that's not an argument to create pot gummy bears and sell them by Philip Morris and, you know, 99% potent in a vape pen. That's an argument to not arrest people for low-level amounts. Those are two very different things. And I think often in our discussion, and I think sometimes purposeful, I hate to say that, but I think that's true in the debate, these things are melded and mixed together to basically, you know, oh, you care about the medical side? All right, I'm going to use that argument with you for something else. Oh, you care about social justice? We're really going to talk about that. When people talk about social justice, I mean, you know, I know we're in a relatively affluent community here. I don't know. I didn't pass that many liquor stores on my way. I didn't see like a cluster of liquor stores around here. Maybe I didn't come the right way. But I'll tell you, you know, I want to talk about the social justice of alcohol. I mean, tell me how that's been working out for us in terms of social justice. Alcohol kills twice as many people as heroin every year. It causes more arrests than all drugs combined when you look at DUI, using in public, and selling to kids. And there are 8 times as many liquor stores in black communities than in white communities. Oh, and you can look at the color of the skin of the people making money from alcohol. So we hadn't figured that one out. And by the way, some people say, well, Kevin, alcohol is legal. So yeah, alcohol is legal. Why is alcohol legal? Let's think about it. Is it legal because it's really good for you? Is it legal because we say, you know what, if only more people in my family drank, we'd be so much better off? Or I saw some people in uniform, or are they thinking, if only more community members had a bottle a little more often, we'd be better off? We don't stop to ever think about it because it's such a normalized part of society, and kind of, oh, you're a prohibitionist if you think anything. So you can't really think about it intelligently. But if you try and think about it intelligently, you think, well, alcohol is not legal because it's safe. It's legal because it's been part of Western civilization for at least before the Old Testament, way before the Old Testament, which is very old, and ancient Greece, and before then. And so we're kind of stuck with it, whether you like it or not. It causes problems. Do you know that for every dollar in tax revenue you get in the state, for alcohol revenue, you spend 12 in social costs? It comes at a great cost. But it's kind of a cost that we've said as a society, we like it, part of liberty. We know it directly contributes to murder more than crack cocaine does, which is true. We know it directly correlates to car crashes way more than heroin or any opiate ever did. We know all those things, but we're okay with it. And it's very hard to prohibit something that 80% of people do on a regular basis, right? I live in Manhattan. Try to prohibit, jaywalking. Very hard to do. 80% of people do it. Same thing with alcohol. So it's here. We're stuck with it. So the issue is, do we want to be stuck with anything else? Doesn't mean that you can't get it still. Of course, anybody can get marijuana. I get it. But the issue is, do you want it to be normalized in a way that's commercialized in this country? Because in our country, commercialized means corporations, multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations making a ton of money on it. That's not, we don't have the Swedish model yet, or the Finland model. If we did, okay, let's talk about what, that might look like, but we don't have that. And for all of these industries, whether it's pharmaceuticals, which, it astounds me when someone can say that, OxyContin is such a problem. Have you ever heard someone say OxyContin and the opioids are such a problem, we should make them more available? We should advertise them more. Of course not. We say, gosh, those corporations got us on that. Purdue Pharma got us on that. And that's a regulated drug. That's a legal drug. We haven't figured that out. We haven't figured out alcohol and tobacco from a public health perspective. Don't think that we're winning the war on smoking, because for every smoker that we don't have, we have 4 more people vaping that are under 18. So, they did a number on us, big tobacco. They're making us think, because we don't smell it anymore, the problem's gone away. Actually, their incidence of lung cancer is going up, not down. And that's also a related issue with the e-cigarettes. And so we haven't figured that out. And Purdue Pharma and all the pharmaceutical companies, put the wool over our eyes for so long, and still do in many, many cases. So in my mind, I'm like, how do we think we're going to figure this one out? Like, we're actually going to get it right for the first time? We're going to be able to do this in a way that isn't going to have corporations profit over people's interests? I've never seen that happen yet in this country. And so I don't believe that will happen. As much as I might want to think it will. But these are very, very different issues than not arresting someone for a joint in their pocket and, not allowing them to go to school or get a loan or get housing or health care or get a job, God forbid. That's a very different thing than the commercialization of it. Now, let's sort of back up. Why do we even care about this in the first place? Because you could say, well, fine, but it's so different than oxy and alcohol. Why do we care about it? Well, we care about it because we know that new marijuana, again, I'm saying marijuana developed over the last 15 years, which is qualitatively different than the marijuana of the past. We know that it affects many, many parts of our brain. And by the way, it affects your parts of the brain whether you're 15 or 50. Differently when you're 15 or 50, because we know that your brain is in rapid development up until about age 30. Is when it does most of its development, up until age 30. And we know that anything that interferes with that development, it could be trauma, abuse, something else exogenous like drugs, any kind of drugs, alcohol, tobacco, whatever, something external, an external chemical, in other words, can have a great effect on you as your brain is developing. And we know for marijuana, it's interesting because we have these receptors all over our brain and body. And sort of for shorthand, we call them cannabinoid receptors, which means that when the body receives THC, which is the active ingredient in the marijuana plant, THC, it receives that and it reacts to that, and that's why you feel high. And your body actually produces natural versions of THC, just like it produces natural versions of opioids. We have opioid receptors all over our brain and body too. But when you get the external THC and the external opioids or whatnot, it's in a way, and that's why drugs are so seducing, it's in a way that is far more powerful than what we would feel naturally. And that's why drugs can be, people call it chemical slavery, or I've heard it be, the brain is I've heard is the most selfish organ of your body because the brain wants this, and that's what addiction is. It wants that, even in the kind of face of negative consequences for somebody who's severely addicted. We all know they will steal from their family members, which they would never do if they didn't have. They'll lie to their family members, which they would never do if their brain wasn't essentially hijacked by these chemicals. And marijuana is a very complex plant. It has hundreds of components, which, by the way, we only know about some of those components. Science is relatively new with the marijuana plant generally. But we do know that it's THC that gets you high. That's what binds to these receptors in the brain, not the other parts of marijuana. CBD, which you've heard of, doesn't really bind to those receptors, and there's some controversy about it, but it's not the same receptors as the THC. You don't get high usually from CBD, so it wouldn't have that same reaction. But for THC, it's binding to these receptors, and it's binding to receptors in certain parts of the brain, just like tobacco does the same thing. So for tobacco, when you smoke a cigarette, for example, that really isn't affecting judgment or movement because we don't have tobacco kind of receptors there, right? So that's why you can smoke a cigarette and drive a car. And right, there's no such thing as a tobacco cigarette related car accident. No such thing, right? That's why most people who built the Brooklyn Bridge all had cigarettes dangling from their mouth. It's a pretty good bridge, right? They weren't, if they had marijuana cigarettes, it might be, it might have gone to Staten Island or something, right? Because with marijuana, with THC, unlike with tobacco, there's a feeling of getting high. There's a feeling of, there's a change. There's an intoxication. Now, there's definitely an addictive nature with tobacco, very addictive. And so the addictive center of the brain is really right here, reward and memory. It's your brain really, really loves something. It feels rewarded, and it remembers that it loves it. That's why you keep going back to something. And with something like THC or other drugs, heroin or whatever, there's that strong feeling. And of course, everyone is different. So while there are studies that show generalizations, I can't say that you're going to have great feeling of reward when you smoke marijuana. In fact, most people who try marijuana, it's kind of like the dirty little secret with it, they don't like it. They actually... 50% of Americans have tried marijuana once. 50% have not. Of the 50% that have, about 75% use it 1 to 3 times. And they never use it again. Tried it in college. They didn't really like it. They didn't like how it made them feel. They felt paranoid. They felt anxious. They didn't like it. They never went back to using it again. A small minority of people really do like it and keep using it. And we think that about now with the new marijuana. So we used to say 10% of people who used marijuana in the last year would be somehow addicted to it. Now that number is about 30%, according to a recent article that came out last year. 30% of people who used marijuana once in the last year are using it at such a level that they're somewhat dependent on THC. And a lot of people say, well, can you even be dependent on it? Isn't that, you've heard the term psychological addiction. There's no such thing as psychological or physical. Addiction is addiction. Your brain did something, it got something it really liked, it remembered that it really liked it, and it wanted to do it again. Now, there are physical symptoms and there are psychological symptoms that come along with different drugs. And like I said, drugs affect people very differently. I mean, my across-the-street neighbor growing up smoked cigarettes for 80 years. He died of old age. But I knew someone in college who smoked for 5 years, developed lung cancer, and died. So, I mean, I know plenty of people who smoke cigarettes or vape or whatever that don't have lung problems. That doesn't mean that cigarettes aren't linked to lung problems. And so a lot of people think, well, I know people, especially in my socioeconomic demographic, that are just fine, that are using it, and they're having no problems with it. And so therefore it must be okay. That's like saying, I sped on the way here, and officer, I promise I did not speed on the way here. Although I had to get here very quickly but anyways, I didn't speed in Connecticut. But that's like saying I sped and I didn't get into a car accident or drive badly, I didn't hit anybody, so therefore speeding is safe. Well, no. Or I didn't wear a seatbelt, got into a car accident, and I'm actually okay. Well, that doesn't mean that seatbelts don't protect people or save lives. In fact, when you think about speed limits, I think it's a good analogy with drug policy, because with a speed limit, we have a speed limit. Plenty of people will violate the speed limit, and they'll be fine. Some people won't, and they won't be fine. But as a society, we've said, you know what? You should not go over 65 here, because if you do, you're risking other people's lives and yourselves and a lot of cost to society. And we know that if you go 10 miles over any given speed limit, your risk of a car crash goes up fourfold. That doesn't mean that you're definitely going to have the car accident, but it means your risk goes up fourfold. So we're going to have some limit, knowing that some people will, of course, violate it. And so when people say, well, Kevin, everybody gets it, and it's, everyone knows how to get it, and it's just kind of like they don't care about the law, and they're not. Well, I think there's still kind of something to do with a law that can set norms. Because if we had no speed limit, well, obviously, more people we know would speed. Of course, doesn't. And that we would have more problems. And so I think when you think about this again, just because the majority of people who smoke cigarettes don't get lung cancer doesn't mean that lung cancer and cigarettes aren't inextricably linked. And for marijuana, it's the same thing with several things. And I'm going to talk about some of those things today, but the big ones in the brain here have to do with judgment and kind of executive functioning, your ability to do something and want to do something and make a good decision that's good for you and your future, as well as your family. When Jerry Brown left the governorship of California last month, he was asked by Maureen Dowd, the New York Times writer, about, said, did you get tax revenue for marijuana? He said, oh my God, no, this was never about taxes. This was about people wanting to get high in California. And he said, and they're all laughing at us in China, which I thought was very interesting. And his whole thing with that is just this idea of motivation and this idea of kind of competitiveness, economic competitiveness. It was very interesting. But we know that we're now learning so much about the brain and about the fact that when it comes to things like mental illness, and there's a book back there. I should recommend my book, which I do, but I also recommend another book there by a friend of mine who has become a friend because of this. It's totally independent of anything that we ever did. Named Alex Berenson, who's from New York and New York Times writer, thought that marijuana was no big deal, like kind of everybody in New York. We all sort of would think that, right? And but whose wife is a forensic psychiatrist and basically came home one night and said, Alex, you were a New York Times reporter. No one ever found anything about marijuana related to mental illness. I never heard about that, but we're seeing so much of it. As a forensic psychiatrist, we're seeing so much of it in crime with mental illness. We're seeing the one drug we're seeing is marijuana. And he said, well, no, I can't. Are you sure it's not opioids? No. What about cocaine? Barely any. It's marijuana. And she said, yeah. And he didn't believe her. He did his own research, mouth dropped to the ground, basically, and when he did his proper research and wrote a book about it, which I highly recommend, called Tell Your Children, which you should read. But again, we're not talking about this. We're talking about things that are in so many different forms. For example, in these forms, which they weren't in the 60s. I mean, your college roommate might have made brownies or something, but this kind of branding wasn't there before. And that's a lot what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with a THC ingredient that has been bred to be increased in very unnatural ways. It's like when I have people say, Kevin, marijuana is natural. What do you have against this God-given plant? Somebody said, are you anti-God because it's a God-given plant? And I said, well, poison ivy is a plant, God-given plant, and I don't want anything to do with that either. By the way, tobacco and opium are plants, and so is coca. Who cares? We've taken opium and processed it into heroin. We've taken coca and processed it into cocaine, something that can stop your heart in a matter of seconds. And so what that it's a plant? This isn't a plant that would occur naturally in nature, naturally without man intervening. We intervened. That's why I don't call it cannabis. And a lot of people say, why don't you call it cannabis? That's the scientific term. That's the term for the genus of the plant from hundreds of years ago. It's not what is out there now. In fact, calling it marijuana is a misnomer too. This is just pure THC, this stuff. It's literally the THC concentrated, injected into gummy bears, lollipops, these waxes. I don't know if many of you are familiar with those. I mean, if I showed you this picture and I said, guess what drug it is? You wouldn't say marijuana if you hadn't, seen a joint since the 60s. You wouldn't say that. But now we're concentrating it in a way, and that's what they're, using in the vaporizers, the cartridges, and they, dabbing. That's what we're talking about. And this is beyond Cheech and Chong's wildest imagination. This is nothing that they, and again, if you laughed at that, you just aged yourself again. Because I said Cheech and Chong to a high school group, they had no idea who I was talking about. Just like when I said Joe Camel, which I'm glad they didn't know what I was talking about there, or the Marlboro Man, which is very interesting. In fact, when I mentioned smoking in airplanes, some kid came up to me and said, "You're making that up." Nobody in their right mind could have thought it was a good idea to smoke something with thousands of carcinogens in a metal bird with wings that already didn't have oxygen in it. Who thought that was it's just, exactly. Somebody did. Just like someone thinks it's a great idea to have this sold by the state and quote-unquote regulated by the state, just like they thought candy cigarettes and cigarettes, even selling to minors, was okay. That's what's about the history repeating. But this is the kind of, when you think about a brown, sticky substance on the end of a hot knife, you do not think marijuana traditionally. And these are the new forms, and this is the new marijuana. This is what I'm worried about. There's been so much in the last 5 years about the vape industry that's incredible. First of all, the Juul started, let's just call them out, as the anti-big tobacco, right? They were the intelligent person's way to ingest tobacco in a safe manner. And, if you smoke 4 packs a day, every day, and you're determined to do that for 50 years, it's probably the vaporizer is, we think, maybe better for you. But other than in that circumstance, we have seen how this has been extremely harmful because it's been targeted at young people. And the vaporizing tobacco and the marijuana industries are actually inextricably linked because they use the same technology. And companies like Juul started as marijuana companies, which not many people know. What's really ironic, because this field is just irony after irony, is that Juul has now been bought 30% of its stake by the exact company they started as being the anti of, and that's Philip Morris again, Altria. Okay. They started as the anti-Philip Morris Altria, and now they're being bought by them. Now, of course, that company is buying up all the marijuana companies north of the border because now it's legal there, so they can do that. So they're all mixed together. And, I'm not going to get into, the timeline here, but if you just kind of look at the different models and things, this all comes together, and it's all linked together. They use a lot of the same social media and things like that, similar branding, and this is the new version of the Marlboro Man and Joe Camel. It's just updated, because you didn't have Instagram back then, but we do now. You didn't have social media influencers that basically, weren't known for anything other than looking cool in front of a webcam, which you have now. And this is the new version of it. As I mentioned, THC available in electronic forms, some of them ironically looking like needles. And they're really, somebody said to me, as a riff off of the president's saying that, these THC items are making smoking cool again. And that's what in many ways it's doing, because if you talk to young people, most of them won't touch cigarettes. Like, they think that's gross. Like, cigarettes, ugh, the smell, it's just disgusting. But when you talk about juuling, or even if you talk about smoking marijuana, it's a totally different thing. There's such a divide in the thinking. And what's really weird is that, we used to say tobacco was the gateway to other drugs because it was so available. Now they're saying, marijuana is now reintroducing smoking, traditional smoking, and e-cigarettes to a generation of young people that never would have smoked otherwise because they thought it was pretty gross. And that's really the ultimate turnaround, something that 10 or 15 years ago wasn't the case. When I have 5 minutes left, you can tell me, because if somebody's timing, it'd be great. There's a lot of data, which I won't go into, about the fact that more people are using non-smoked marijuana than ever before. That's the trend in what's happening, so I want to just keep going on that. There's now, as if we couldn't come up with something more insidious, marijuana-infused alcohol. It's like, so these things are now coming together. So these products are in many ways merging. And there's big money behind it, big companies. This isn't like a small little brewery craft beer that's trying some flavor out. This is, Coors. This is Constellation Brands, which is one of the biggest alcohol companies in the world. Billions into the marijuana industry because they see money. When you look at these industries, it's very important to understand that most people, for example, drink alcohol responsibly. They don't drink a lot of. Most people drink like 2 drinks a week or something. I mean, very, very moderate amounts of alcohol. But 10% of us drink 75% of the whole volume of alcohol in this country, an average of 10 drinks a day. 10% of us. That 10% is responsible for the vast majority of the revenue of the alcohol industry. So whenever you see "enjoy responsibly" on the bottom of an ad, beer ad, it's very funny, because if everybody enjoyed responsibly, we'd not have the alcohol industry we have today. They only make money from heavy users. Let's talk about OxyContin again for a minute. Have a guess in your head. I'm not going to ask you to reveal your answer, of the percentage of people prescribed OxyContin who abuse it, basically who use it in a non-medical manner. Think about what you think that percentage is, given our opioid epidemic. It may surprise you to learn that percentage is only about 14%. So 86% of us, we don't have an opioid problem, and we were overprescribed opioids. We're not addicted to opioids. It only took 14% to consume. Do you know how much of all the pills they're consuming, that 14%? About 80% of the pills dispensed. And those are the people that are dying or becoming addicted. It doesn't take much. Like, don't think that they have to get, because a lot of people say, well, Kevin, if it's legal, I'm not going to go use it tomorrow. What, am I going to just use crack if it's legal tomorrow? No, I don't want to use it, and I'm not going to use marijuana if I don't want to. They don't need everyone to start to use it tomorrow. They just need your kids to grow up in a way that it's normalized and on TV and Super Bowl ads and sports branding and celebrities, and they only need about 10% of your kids to become severely in trouble with it to make money. And that's really important to understand about the economics of how this all works, because I think we're all kind of wired to say, like, it wouldn't happen to me or my family, or it doesn't happen over here, and none of us would use it if it was legal or whatever it is. We're not going to use 99% vapes. But again, when you look at generations over time and the normalization, that changes. Let's go ahead. I'm very concerned with the new research on the mental illness issue, which is what Alex talks about in his book. The C word in science is a very dirty word. You never want to use it because you'll lose all credibility. Causal. You only want to use it in the context of gravity or something. Like, if I let go of this apple, it will drop. It causes the apple to drop. Gravity causes the apple to drop. That's basically in science, and then we stop. Because if you use it anymore, you're going to be discredited because of... But the scientific community, their words, not mine, are now using that word way more than we've ever seen with regards to high-potent marijuana. Not low-potent, highly potent marijuana. And they're using causal when it comes to things like psychotic breaks, which over time, in a certain percentage of people, develop into schizophrenia, which is the worst kind of mental illness you can ever think about, and suicide ideations, suicide attempts. And these are things we didn't really see until about the late 80s. The new research was coming out because marijuana was becoming little by little more potent, and in certain populations, you were seeing increases, but it was very hard to say if that had to do with the marijuana, because maybe it has, it's sort of a chicken before the egg, is it self-medicating? But now the studies have become a lot more sophisticated, and you should and I always tell people, do the research yourself, especially when I talk to young people, because I know they will anyway, but Wikipedia isn't the only source out there. Just be very clear about that. And if you want to look at sources, look at the National Academy of Sciences. Don't take my word for it. Read, Lancet Psychiatry. Read the most prominent medical journals and understand what they say, rather than something that the marijuana industry, because they own so many news corporations now, they create their own news. So you wouldn't even know. You would Google marijuana and suicide, and you'd get 5 websites that look perfectly legitimate and scientific, and unless you really read the fine print somewhere in some back page, you would have no idea who funded it. So I avoid those things. Read things that are established, like NIH and those kind of standard resources, and you'll see these things yourself. Depression as well is another part something that we're very concerned about. Anxiety, and all kinds of things that we're seeing journal articles in the last 3 or 4 years we've never seen before that have to do with that. We're seeing. I'm not going to play the video. And okay, we can play. Well, we don't need to play the video, but we're seeing new things like cannabis they call it Hyperemesis Syndrome, which is uncontrollable vomiting that the ER had never seen before. 10 years ago, didn't exist. And now with highly potent marijuana, I don't know how many of you have heard of that. Sometimes it's called scromiting, which is like very nasty word. But the scientific term is Hyperemesis Syndrome. And it's something that we're seeing a lot more of in the ER, which we had never really seen before. We'll make sure this is for you, that you have the access to this presentation. The other thing that we're seeing, which we hadn't seen before, is and this might be, might matter to the, juniors and seniors thinking about college and beyond, is the moderate to heavy marijuana use and the reduction in IQ and intelligence. It's kind of obvious that usually, you don't become the smartest tool in the shed if you smoke a lot of weed. But we're now seeing bigger changes than we'd ever seen before. And so this study showed a reduction of 8 points on average in the IQ of a set of young people who were matched exactly the same to other young people in terms of socioeconomic and everything else. And the group that used marijuana basically 3 to 4 times a week for 3 years, so it's pretty moderate to heavy, that they were at a statistically significantly increased risk of having an IQ reduction of 8 points versus the group that did not use. Now, we don't, what is 8 points? It's hard to we don't really talk about IQ scores anymore, but 8 points is about a few $1 million in lost lifetime income. 8 points is enough to take you an average to above average student relative to everyone else to a below average student. It's what we call in science half of a standard deviation. It's a lot. It's not something you mess with. And that doesn't mean that if you smoke marijuana, you're definitely going to be 8 points dumber or something like that, but you're increasing that risk in a way that, I think is a word of caution if you care about that. All kinds of studies in other countries, because other countries it's not just the U.S. that studied marijuana. And a lot of people say, well, can we even study it because it's illegal? The answer is yes, we can. There's a myth that we can't study it because it's illegal. Heroin is illegal. We've done a lot of studies on it. Crack is illegal. We've done a lot of studies on it. Marijuana is illegal. We've done a lot of studies on it. We should do more. But other countries have also done a ton of work. And there's a lot of research. I encourage you to look at the research in the UK and New Zealand and Sweden, Australia. This is a New Zealand study. It followed thousands of kids over time. All kinds of behaviors, not just marijuana. But, you know, you can extrapolate different things. It basically found over time, the more you used, the more likely you were to be welfare dependent, unemployed, and less likely you were to gain a university degree. Doesn't mean that a lot of people didn't gain a university degree who used marijuana. Of course they did. But you were less likely when clustered with your peers among thousands of peers and you put them in order. The ones that used had the worst life outcomes when they followed these kids about 10 to 15, 20 years over time. Those are powerful studies. We call them longitudinal studies. They're not just studies we do in a lab with a couple of rats and we say, well, 10 of the rats liked marijuana, 8 of them didn't, so we think that it's, we like them as humans. No. This is something that thousands of people over time were observing behaviors in natural settings. And that's very powerful, especially if you can control for a lot of things, which you can. I like to go back into my history lesson and talk about how a coconized wine was the answer to heroin addiction 100 years ago, opium addiction. And throughout time, we've always said one drug is the answer to another drug's addiction. So I'm hearing whispers now of people saying, we have an opioid epidemic. And when I say people, I really mean like the marketers of the marijuana industry, because that's really what they are, and they're very good at what they do. I got to hand it to them. They're very good at what they do. I mean, they've taken a drug that in the last 15 years, science has shown is more dangerous to make everyone believe that it's totally harmless. They've done an incredible job. And what they're saying now for opioids is that, wouldn't you rather your mom take pot instead of opioids if they have pain? Sounds pretty good, right? Because, you can die from opioids, and we always hear about no one ever dies from marijuana. By the way, tell that to the thousands of people who have car crashes on the road, who have seen their kids go from marijuana to other drugs, who have seen the suicide, who have seen the schizophrenia, and they're in a state where they can't function in life. I want anybody who says this doesn't affect your life or even kill you to talk to those parents that I talk to almost every day first. But that aside, this idea is very tempting. That if you have pain, I'd rather you use marijuana than a deadly drug like OxyContin. It's very, very tempting to think that. The reality is the studies are not showing that that's really happening, that people are making that substitute, or that substitute is even good. In fact, we're finding both of those drugs for long-term pain are a bad idea. Opioids are not, they were never meant for long-term pain management. Opioids were meant for hospital acute pain management. Like the Dilaudid I talked about with this liquid heroin, essentially, which is a little bit stronger than something like OxyContin. That was meant for the way I did it, in a hospital setting, under hospital supervision, never to take home. Unfortunately, the Purdue Pharma and all of their buddies in the pharmaceutical industry, which include the Sackler family and others, unfortunately, they convinced Congress and regulators, because they had lobbyists and they could pay for them, that we should have people go home with OxyContin, which again is a warning to us to allow any other drug industry to get in there, because we know they're going to convince our legislators. That's my worry. And opioids were never, do you know that there's not one study in the literature showing long-term pain effectiveness from opioids? It's hard to believe. It's very hard to believe. How did they get the approval? Short-term, it's effective. That's why when you dislocate your shoulder, yes, if you need to have 1 or 2 OxyContins under a doctor's supervision, that's probably safe. But I dislocated mine, and I sound very injury prone, I'm talking about my injuries. I dislocated mine in the year 2000, and I was given 150 OxyContins, or Percocets. Again, I was one of the 86% that wasn't affected by it, and I didn't use more than one. But that's unfortunately how we got into this mess. And then to say, well, marijuana is now the answer, especially today's high-potent marijuana, it doesn't make sense, and it's just like repeating history. There's a lot of studies you should read about that. One is the Lancet study. It followed 1,500 marijuana and opioid users to see if there was a substitute effect, and there was not a substitute effect. In fact, when you ask people, they didn't even think the marijuana helped their pain over time. It does help with short-term nausea, THC with short-term nausea for people with cancer or those kinds of, that's a different story. But anyhow, you can read those studies. Let me go ahead a little bit. So that's the book, Reefer Sanity, that we updated last year. There's another academic textbook that I helped write as well called Contemporary Health Issues, if you're really interested in getting deep into the science. The book that's changing the debate that I'm very happy about is Alex's book that's out there. I don't get a penny from it, by the way, so I'm just telling you it's a good book. I don't get a penny from my book either, by the way, anymore. That's the publishing industry today, but we can talk about that later. We have publishers in the audience. I am concerned about youth marijuana use. You know, teens today are way better behaved than their parents in terms of using alcohol, cigarettes, and really all drugs and all kinds of risky behaviors. Premarital sex or unprotected sex, all kinds of things. You know, for all the, and I love to, like my nieces and nephews that are millennials, I love to say, oh, you're such a millennial thing you did, and it's so irresponsible, whatever. The reality is, and they're not here so I can say it, millennials are way more responsible than Generation X. And the baby boomers. Remember what you all did in the 60s and stuff? Yeah, they're not doing that. And yet, so we're seeing reductions in alcohol, actually. Drinking way less than the past. It's very interesting. In fact, the opioid epidemic and the addiction epidemic it's not the majority of the people that are dying and that are having the problems are people who've been using drugs for a long time. And they're, 47 years old, white male with very little hope in life, and then they're having their 9th overdose. They don't have naloxone around, they die. That's unfortunately a lot of it today. And we're using teens, I should say, young people, millennials, and younger, way less than their parents. Even with all of that, the one drug that is either stable or going up in different areas is marijuana and vaping. So juuling or using any kind of marijuana, whether it's smoked, eaten, in the cartridges or whatever. And I think that's concerning, even though all other drugs are plummeting. I mean, kids aren't, you know how many kids used heroin last year in the heroin epidemic that we have in this country? It was less than 0.1% of high school students or high school seniors. It's not some massive number right now, even though we have an addiction issue in our country. It's much more complex than that. You can look at the studies about what's happened in legalized states. I won't get into a lot of detail there. I think I made it clear about how I feel regarding certain policies and how I feel regarding certain industries. I think at the very least we just need to slow down and see what's going on in other states, see what this marijuana is really about, look at the studies about how it's affecting young people and older people, because it also affects older people. It's not only something that affects young people. And really get the science understood before we kind of go full throttle towards a policy that will be probably irreversible if we, get it wrong and choose the wrong path. So my email is there. The website is learnaboutsam.org. You'll see our homepage is the board of directors of Philip Morris and Altria, because we like to remind people who's making money off of our kids and off of addiction in this country. And we like to remind people that this isn't about hippies and Cheech and Chong and Grateful Dead anymore. This is about, like I said earlier, the wolves of Wall Street, and this is about big tobacco getting involved in this new industry and funding our politicians. I hate to say it. By the way, any politician who has an opinion on this, just look and see where the money's coming from. Just follow the money. And if you're interested in getting more involved in Connecticut specifically, we have a great group and a great chapter of SAM, and I don't know if there's any of you here, a great chapter of SAM Connecticut that's doing a lot of work in the Capitol and really actually being very effective in slowing the train down. The last thing I'll say is no legislature in the country has ever passed marijuana legalization. Only states have it who have voted on it through referenda. Because every time it's been introduced in the legislature, which I think now, if you add all states up over the last 4 years, I think it's been introduced 20 times, 30 times, it's failed once the discussion happened. Once people said, well, what about driving? Do we have a .08 equivalent for marijuana like we do alcohol? No. Okay. Can we detect impairment with technology today? I mean, we're 2019, we have self-driving cars and people are going to space and God knows. I mean, can we do that? No, we can't. We don't have an impairment level. Oh. Do we know, the other question, do we know what's in the stuff they're selling in Colorado? Do we at least know what's in it? No. Well, why not? Well, because claims are made, and then when they're tested in non-biased labs that don't have a financial incentive to say that it's one thing or the other, we're finding out it doesn't even have what it says it has in it. And the levels of THC are so varied that no state has been able to regulate it. And then when a legislator asks us, well, we're going to at least save law enforcement costs, right? Because we're not going to go after pot users. Actually, no. States that have legalized are spending more on law enforcement. How's that? Well, because they're trying to detect drug drivers. They're going after public use. The black market is thriving because drug dealers love it. They get to undercut the legal price, sell you something that is 30% cheaper than what the state in all of its wisdom and taxes is selling you. And they're making out like bandits. So when these questions actually get aired out on the legislative level, because there are not good answers, it's very difficult to do this. When it's a ballot initiative and you have, like Sean Parker, who was a co-founder of Facebook, who really likes weed and wants to make money from it, write a $25 million check to put 10 commercials on TV the last week of the vote, yeah, then you'll pass it. When you have the industry that sees this as an investment, and you have 30-second commercial spots where you say all kinds of myths that go unchallenged, yeah, you can convince 55% of Coloradans and 53% of Massachusetts voters that it's a good idea. But when you actually have to discuss it, it becomes a lot hairier, a lot more difficult. And so I hope I gave you maybe something to think about, a couple things I hope to think about tonight, maybe some things you didn't know, and then maybe we can get into questions. So thank you all for coming tonight. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. That was awesome. You've done an amazing job of taking some pretty complex issues and breaking them down into some really clear messaging.
Thank you.
Kind of reminds me of Tom McClellan's the only other person I know that can do that with policy in such an effective way.
It's a high honor. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Okay, Team Orange, it's time to collect the cards. If people have cards that you want me to ask the questions, Tiffany, Alan, Leo, everybody in orange, can't miss them. Have them collected and bring them over to me. While we're waiting for that, you've answered a lot of the questions I had. So we've made no progress on any scientific measures for driving under the influence.
Yeah, so we don't have a .08 equivalent. There are technology companies that are trying to come up with new ways to detect THC in your body, like with an oral swab, because it's unrealistic to draw blood on the side of the road or something like that. Right now, if you get pulled over, depending on the state, it might be 7 hours until you're tested, because you do like a behavioral test, and you go to the station, and you give consent, and you go to the lab. I mean, it's very difficult. So, yeah, we haven't made a lot of progress on that at all.
Will we ever be Portugal, and why not?
Okay, wow. So let's talk about Portugal. How many of you know what Portugal did in drug policy about 15 years ago? Raise your hand if you know that. Okay, about 10%, not even 10%. Okay, we'll do a quick explainer. Portugal, country of about 6 million Catholics, pretty homogeneous, decided in 2001, after having a major problem with heroin and other drugs, that they were going to take what they call a public health approach, not legalize, which is the big misnomer. People think they've legalized drugs. They have not. In fact, they look at what Colorado's doing and they just scratch their heads and say, oh, those Americans. But what they did is say, they have an administrative legal system. So we have civil criminal, they also have administrative, which basically says that if you get caught with a small amount of any drug, you go through an administrative system, not criminal or civil, where you go in front of some experts, a social worker, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, and they assess if you have a drug problem or not. And if you do, you go to treatment. They give you options. And if you don't, you get a slap on the wrist, or don't use more cocaine, because if you use more, you'll probably have a problem with it. We wouldn't want to see you in the hospital. Okay. They're called dissuasion commissions. And at the same time, they implemented a very robust treatment regimen where they allowed all kinds of medication-assisted treatment and kind of a whole, like if you came to a police station and you said, I want help, you got it. If you came to a hospital, you got treatment on demand. It's a small country, they could do that. And basically, we've found over time that it's reduced overdose. There's mixed answers on whether it's reduced drug use or if it's kind of the same. I've seen a lot of mixed data. But overall, the sky hasn't fallen, and they've gotten some positive results. The craziest thing about Portugal is that people will take that and think that that was legalization. And again, it wasn't. It was kind of it was its own thing. And something, now the question was, could we ever do that here? Mm-hmm. In a country of 300 and some million Americans and the way our criminal justice system works, it's difficult to imagine that we'll get to where Portugal is, where it's a lot easier to do what they did. On the other hand, we have things like drug courts, we have things like probation, hope probation, we have things like alternatives to incarceration, diversion programs that evaluate somebody, and if they have a problem, get them help. We have things like in Massachusetts and other states, probably here, where a lot of police departments are saying, if you come to us, we're not going to arrest you for heroin, especially in the opioid epidemic. We're going to send you to treatment and give you naloxone and all that kind of stuff. So I think there is a way to have a version of that, which basically means we're not going to punish people and we're going to get them health that they need. But what's amazing about, and what's different about drugs, which is, it's hard, is that often you have, think about a drunk driver, right? You have a drunk driver that hurts someone else, but they're addicted to alcohol. Well, we have to find a way. The smart thing is they have to be punished because they hurt somebody, but they probably should be helped too, because we don't want, when they get out of jail in 4 years, for them to go back to the behavior they were at before and reoffend. So how do you do that balance of the punishment that's not too severe, because we incarcerate way too many people in this country, but also get them the help that they need, but be just. It's a balance. Drug court, I'm a big fan of drug courts, which are specialized courts for folks that are addicted, that give people access to treatment, but also say, if you don't go to treatment, there will be consequences. And I think that makes sense. Right now, our criminal justice system, in many ways, it's the worst of both worlds. It's overly severe, but also random. And if you're trying to change behavior, it's the wrong way to change behavior. It's like telling your 10-year-old, Johnny, if you don't clean your room today, there's a 50% chance that in 6 months I'm going to ground you for a year. Imagine saying that to your kid. If you don't clean your room, there's a 50% chance that in 6 months I'm going to ground you for a year. It's crazy. Versus if you said, if you don't clean your room, you're not going to the movies tonight. Done. Not going to the movies is a far less punishment severe than a year being grounded. But the fact that it's a certain punishment that comes quickly, if it happens, behavior changes. And for most people on drugs, it's so interesting. Most people who stop using drugs, they don't go to treatment. That's an amazing thing. It's something that I never realized. Most people stop using drugs because of some other external motivation in their life. Best example of this is our president before the last one, George W. Bush, who was addicted to alcohol. Now, he goes to AA now, or he did, but he didn't stop drinking because he was either going to go to treatment or go to jail or something. He stopped drinking because his new wife said, if you drink like this, you're not allowed in the house anymore. We're done. That was enough motivation. That doesn't mean that's going to be motivation for everyone, because some of us know loved ones and others who have been given every chance in the world and all the help and support and all the tough love, and you're done and you're not. And it wasn't enough because the drugs were too powerful for that person. We're all different. There are multiple paths to recovery, as we like to say. There's not a one-size-fits-all. That's a very long answer, but It's a complicated question.
I got several questions.
Okay.
I can morph into
That'd be
one
great.
here. Talk to me about CBT. Is it safe? What is it? Many people want to know.
Great. CBD, right? It's like the new aloe vera, if you remember that from the 80s. Everywhere, all of a sudden. There was nothing, and then all of a sudden it's at my gym in the smoothies. It's like there's like a hand sanitizer. It's a lotion. It's everywhere, and we don't even know what it is. I mean, it's very hard to know what it is, and what I mean by that is you often don't know what's in what is being. So the short answer is, get it if you really like it, but it's the source. We don't know a lot of the CBD that's out there. Now, let me back up a little bit. What is CBD? It is a component naturally found in marijuana that has been generally bred out of marijuana that you get high from, because it does not get you high. So if you look at black market pot that people are getting and you test it, it's not going to have hardly any CBD in it. It's been bred out of the plant. I had a chart up there. It showed CBD levels over the last 50 years almost gone in confiscated marijuana. Why? Because it doesn't get you high. It actually takes the high away. Now, fast forward a little bit. We have learned that it could help some young people with things like intractable epilepsy that's not responsive to numerous medications. It can be helpful. When I say it, I mean purified CBD that really is CBD. And that's the trick. You don't know what really is CBD. But the FDA has approved a medication, a CBD medication, called Epidiolex for kids with some of these intractable epilepsy diseases. And that is available now, which I think is a great thing. And other people get CBD from a medical marijuana dispensary or a medical marijuana store. And some of them have found that it's helpful. Others, they haven't found that it's helpful, and it just depends on the person. You often don't know what you're getting unless it is the FDA-approved product, and that's my big worry. And this stuff about like a drop of CBD in the salad dressing and a drop in the lotion and all that, boy, most studies that show any result from CBD have a lot of CBD in them. So the idea that you're going to be getting some boost from your smoothie, if you think it helps you, great, because you're going to be part of the placebo, which is huge. Placebo effect is big. You think you're going to get an effect, you'll get an effect sometimes. Great. And if it works for you, fine. I caution people going to buy a CBD candy bar or something that has a lot of CBD as advertised, because you don't really know what's in it or how you're going to react to it. The FDA has recently said you cannot sell CBD products unless we have approved it for food, for example. You can't just put it in something. And right now we're living in a very weird time where it's kind of quasi-legal, quasi-illegal, because, to make it more complicated, there is CBD derived from hemp plants. Hemp is the stalk and fiber and a cousin of marijuana. It gets very complicated. But then there's CBD derived from regular marijuana, and they're different. So it gets very convoluted. And at the end of the day, it's probably not going to kill you, or you're not going to have some very bad effect from it. Does it? Some of them have mold and pesticides and things. Yes, the FDA has tested dozens of products advertised as CBD, and they have found additives, molds, pesticides, and levels of CBD that are not advertised. So it's a little bit buyer beware. I still think we're learning a lot more about it. Could it be helpful for a range of diseases? It's very possible, but time will tell, and that's what I would say about CBD.
A morph of another question. Are there evidence-based prevention programs to help dissuade kids from using marijuana?
Yeah, well, that's a tougher question. You think that'd be more straightforward than the CBD one, which was tough. You know, there is a history of I believe strongly in drug prevention. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean the DARE officer is saying this is what drugs are, don't do them, it's going to kill you? Or does it mean more like the life skills stuff? The evidence shows more life skills and behavioral skills and resiliency and things like that are better prevention than simply showing a drug. On the other hand, we know from tobacco cessation, right? The fact that we've had the reduction in tobacco. How did that happen? Well, it happened because we started really showing the negative effects of tobacco on people. And it also started because we frankly vilified big tobacco, and kids responded to that. How do you get a 5-year-old not? I hope there's no McDonald's executives in the room here. How do you get a 5-year-old not to want a Happy Meal? Not by telling them that the hamburger has a 30% chance of causing them high cholesterol, LDL, in 50 years and a heart arrhythmic reaction. The 5-year-old is going to say, who cares? But when you tell the 5-year-old that you're being tricked by McDonald's that it has to give you a toy to make you think this food is good, they'll react to that. And that's interesting. And that's what we've seen with tobacco, is when we started talking, really in my generation, that growing up, that there was big tobacco and they hid documents and they had, you know, they they targeted kids and young people and vulnerable populations. People really reacted to that. So I think with marijuana, it's very tricky because we're in an environment that is so normalized and accepted. So we, in many ways, have to meet kids where they're at. So if we come at it with, this is going to cause psychosis and you're all going to be violent tomorrow if you smoke weed, you probably will lose a lot of them. But if you come at it with kind of meeting them where they're at, which is what we should do, but also being very straightforward about, I just tell a young person, do whatever the heck you want, but your brain until you're age 30 is a dollar sign to some people who, would really want to see ill on you for their profit gain. Do whatever you want. That is often more effective than this is going to cause psychosis in 30% of people, so you might murder somebody, so don't do this. It does depend on the person, of course, but there are prevention coalitions, which I think are very good. Prevention messaging, where, again, you talk about the harms in a way that is believable, because there's otherwise, you'll be, like I've been accused of, reefer madness. Like if you say anything bad about marijuana, you're part of a 1930s church film that said if you smoke weed, shock and horror, you're going to marry someone of a different race. This is basically what it said. And I don't know. I think that's bad. I think a lot of the drug laws and things like that have, of course, racist roots, like a lot of our laws do in this country. But I'm concerned about what the science is saying in 2019, not what a church film may have said or didn't say in 1930, or what a, Timothy Leary said in 1960. I'm thinking about what does the science say today, and I think if we can talk about that in a direct fashion to young people, it's effective.
Great, thank you. Where does the health insurance industry stand on this topic?
Well, they basically are not making a stand on this topic. And you would think that a lot of industries, frankly, should be funding not to legalize because it's not in their interest. For example, in states that have legalized, insurance premiums have gone up. Insurance is a big issue, just car insurance. Forget about health insurance for a minute. But for a lot of people, for corporations, this is and I've talked to CEOs of many corporations. We have a very small nonprofit funded basically by volunteers and by parents who have lost kids and by very small family foundations. But the reason we haven't even been very successful with corporate funding is that this is seen as a political issue, and they don't want to get involved in a political issue. It's like for them getting involved in gay marriage or something. They see it now. Of course, when they say that to me, my answer is, this is very different than same-sex marriage, whether you love same-sex marriage or don't love same-sex marriage. If my kid's bus driver is smoking pot, waking and baking every day, that affects me. If my kid's bus driver is in a same-sex marriage, I could love it, I could hate it. It doesn't affect their driving. My kid's safety isn't in peril. My safety when I'm on an airplane isn't in peril if the pilot happens to be heterosexual or homosexual. But if the pilot is using 99% vapes and not getting tested that day, I care. And it affects me and it affects my loved ones. And so this is a public health and safety issue. This is not a culture war, individual liberty. I could care less if you're a 50-year-old dude who wants to smoke weed and go to sleep on a Friday night and just waste away your weekend to be unproductive. But if you're going to get on the road or be my doctor or teach my kid or work in the factory with me or be my employee who has to get to work on time or be all these other things that we rely on people in a forward-thinking society for, then it does affect me. And when people lump this in with sort of these culture war kind of issues, I really take issue to that because this is very different. One is a civil rights or religious or moral, whatever issue you want to call it, and one is a public health and safety issue. They're very different. But companies have had a hard time understanding that distinction. So health insurance should care, but right now they don't. I think they will soon, but I think right now it's too much of a hot potato.
You talked about some of the discussions around opiate for pain management and marijuana. What about the discussions now about strategizing the opiate epidemic and reducing deaths, that there's some belief that in those states where marijuana is legal for recreational, there's a reduction in opiate deaths. Is there data supporting that?
So there were about 2 studies claiming what we just heard, that in states that have lax marijuana policies, lo and behold, opioid deaths are lower. What those studies didn't tell you is that, first of all, they stopped looking at data after about 2010 or 2012. So that Colorado legalized in 2012. And what they also didn't tell you is that they didn't control for other things that might have reduced drug deaths during that time. So if you had a prescription drug monitoring program that sent an alert if you started to go to 7 different pharmacies, which is what people used to do, they called smurfing, to get different, the same prescription and get different, and I don't know why it's called, I forget why it's called smurfing, but to get different, prescriptions dispensed to you, then there's an alert that's going to stop you from doing that. If there was, different programs like naloxone, which can reduce overdose in some people, often it's very effective. And what's interesting about opioid overdose, just real quick, is in that picture of the brain I showed you, we have opioid receptors in our brain stem that controls our breathing and our heart. Thank God we don't have cannabinoid receptors in our brain stem. That's why you can't really stop breathing when you use marijuana. Thank God, because the THC is not binding to those receptors. The opiates are binding to the receptors in the brain stem. That's when you can basically pass out and die. And naloxone is an antidote that works against those receptors that, it can be magic for some people, bringing them back to life. Point of saying that is that when you don't control for a lot of those things, you can make these very wild claims. I think they're very dangerous, and I understand how legislators are looking for anything to reduce the opioid epidemic, and they want to check the box. I'm doing what I can, and I'm fighting this, and it's like, they're doing anything that they can because it's in the news, and nobody really cares about pot, so sure, let's do that and try that, and no one's going to get mad at me, so I'll do that. It might be politically expedient now. I think it's very, very, very dangerous to say to a population that's addicted that you are now saying, you know what, if we had 99% THC available, you'd be better off as a drug user. I really worry about it.
Last question, specific question from a parent. When I talk to my sons, age 21 and 23, about using or not using pot, their response is, I choose to drink alcohol. They choose to smoke pot, and there is no difference. What should be my response?
Well, first of all, there's a big difference. And a lot of people like to say they're the same, choose one, and whatnot. They're not the same at all. First of all, alcohol is in and out of your body in less than 24 hours. THC stays in your system longer. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because your behavior is affected, whether you really realize it or not, longer, because it stays in your brain and it stays longer in your body than alcohol. Secondly, the only reason to drink is not necessarily to get drunk and feel drunk. The reason you use marijuana is to get high. You don't say, well, if only I could have this joint with that steak, it would taste really good. That's not how it works. I'm not encouraging alcohol use. You heard me earlier say that alcohol has killed more people than all illegal drugs combined. It is connected to criminal justice costs. Your officer here spends more time because of people on alcohol than ever did on opioids. And yet, when you look at that, it is different. Critical difference, and this is Alex's point, we do not see the mental illness long-term, even really short-term, among people that use alcohol. And when you look at drinkers, we know that about 20% of people who drank in the last month drank every day. 45% of people who used marijuana in the last month used it every day. It is because of today's high-potent marijuana, it is very different. It's also unhealthy. I'm not, again, encouraging alcohol, but it is different. And, I get that people say that's what you do and then I'm going to do this. By the way, very few the studies on alcohol and marijuana show that most people use these things together. That 21-year-old, I would be very surprised if they didn't drink. The idea that a 16-year-old comes and says, I'm going to use a lot of marijuana, but I'll never touch beer. It's about as crazy as when I hear parents who say, I'm going to drink with my kid because that means they'll only drink with me. Because, every 16-year-old boy says yes to their best friend. I can't drink with you, buddy. I only drink with my dad. This is adult logic which I mean that as an insult. It's illogical to a young person. I don't mean it as an insult to the young person. I mean that's an insult. And so it's the same kind of thing. Like if only we had this available, this would be used less. It's fascinating to think if we could replace every drinker with a marijuana user and what that would be. That's an interesting thought exercise. I don't think that would be a good thing. But even if it's a good thing or a bad thing, all it is a theory. The reality is people use things together. Substance abuse and the addiction epidemic is not because of one substance. And this is what we have. And this is coming from the guy who started an organization about one substance, marijuana. I'm telling you, when we talk and think about addiction, we're not just thinking about one drug. This is something that it's much more than that. And it actually is beyond drugs. It's about all kinds of other social behavioral issues. And we have to treat these things holistically. That's why I worry about any kind of drug policy that only focuses on, okay, all we're going to do is deal with this person's overdose and then forget about it. Well, no. Yes, deal with their overdose because we don't want them dead. But let's not forget about it. Let's realize that there's a lot more we have to do as a society. And so when it goes back to this issue of marijuana and we talk about the normalization of more drugs, even more so than we have right now, that takes us away, and I'll end here, with kind of the North Star, which should be, I think, to discourage the use of intoxicating substances. And so I always just think, is whatever we're doing discouraging unhealthy behavior or encouraging healthy behavior? When we have a speed limit, does that encourage speeding? No, some people will speed, but it probably discourages speeding. That's why we have it in the first place. I think of it the same way with substances. So we want to encourage or discourage. Some people will say, well, why do we want to discourage, Kevin? I'm a better songwriter when I smoke, when I do whatever drugs. Some people will be, and that's fine. But when you look at the whole of human society and you put that into frankly, the commercialized, materialistic society we have today, and you bring in the commercialization of high potency, new technologies, the vapes and all these other things, I think at the very least we should slow down if our goal is to discourage and instead encourage healthy lifestyles, which I think we should do. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.